Okay, so we're here with Alex Adams, Dr. Adams, who is the Director of the Division of Financial Management for the state of Idaho. Thanks for joining us, Alex.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
I always start by asking people how they came to have the role they have in state and local government. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I kind of came to the world of state budgeting through the circuitous route. I started off my career as a pharmacist. Dad, grandpa, and great grandpa were all pharmacists, and I pursued the family craft. And early in my pharmacy career, I got really interested in the policy and regulatory side of the profession, and ended up at an association in DC for 7 years, working on state government affairs issues and other issues for the pharmacy profession. And then married an Idaho girl, and we found our way back to Idaho, where I led the State Board of Pharmacy. It's a small state regulatory agency overseeing pharmacies, pharmacists, manufacturers, distributors, the opioid tracking system, things like that. And really learned the nuts and bolts of state government through that role. And when Governor Little was elected in 2018, he asked if I would come lead DFM, the Division of Financial Management, and I took office with him in January of 19, and I've had really interesting first 18 months on the job of trying to manage a state budget in pretty interesting times.
Well, let's talk about the role that DFM has in the state budget. Can you explain in general terms how DFM helps prepare the budget and then implement it?
Yeah, so the first step in the budgeting process is each executive branch agency. So that's health and welfare, environmental quality, the Department of Corrections, the state police, and everybody down to the Commission for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing. They all put together their agency budget requests for the subsequent year, and they submit them to DFM. DFM rolls those up into a singular executive branch budget, and the governor has to make a budget recommendation that's due the first week of the legislative session. So each agency will put together their priorities. And, you know, I'm a former agency head when I ran the Board of Pharmacy. Of course, pharmacy issues were the most important issue in the state. And I had a list of budget requests a mile long. I needed a new position for this. I needed a new database for that. The governor has to look holistically across state government and determine where are our priorities. And so the governor rolls up all the agency budget requests into an executive branch budget. He makes his own recommendations, which means sometimes he'll take out line item requests from agencies. Sometimes he'll augment line item requests. I'll give you an example. When the governor took office, his top priority was literacy, and we doubled the literacy budget for the state in the State Board of Education budget when he took office. So primary role is developing the executive budget recommendation. Governor looking at it holistically, looking at all of the priorities competing against each other and deciding where we're going to put our scarce fiscal resources. The starting point for that is often the revenue forecast. So DFM also does the economic forecasting for the state. We have economists on staff who are looking at trends in income tax, sales tax, corporate income tax, and oftentimes your revenue forecast is the most important step in the budgeting because it determines how much you're able to spend, which then drives the prioritization of competing interests from executive branch agencies. DFM then presents that budget to the legislature, and the legislature has a joint budget committee that will hear every budget, have the agencies present, ask DFM why we made the recommendations that we did, and then ultimately the legislature will pass appropriation bills that go to the governor's desk for signature or veto.
Okay. You stopped suddenly. Sorry, you caught me off guard there. In a normal year, this can be tough. Forecasting how much money is going to be in the state coffers at any given point. And, you know, my memory looking back is that there are often competing forecasts, you know, some rosier than others. What has it been like this year when we thought we had a look at what it was going to be like? You and I were on Idaho Reports together for the State of the State address to talk about that on the news. And what a world of difference we're in now, almost, well, 8 months later.
Yeah, so forecasting is always tough. And, you know, we say it's kind of the equivalent of trying to drive forward by looking through your rearview mirror. You're trying to forecast based off of recent trends and then build some uncertainty into it. And one of the things that we started doing with Governor Little is running multiple different forecasts. And we run an optimistic scenario, a pessimistic scenario, and then we run a baseline scenario. And we assign probabilities to each of those. And this governor's been budgeting a little bit more on the pessimistic side. We'd rather budget conservatively and come in higher than budget optimistically and hope for the best. Hope is rarely an effective budget strategy. So when we last talked, Dr. Witt, it was in January. It was when we presented the budget. It was the day of the state of the state, and Idaho was a red hot economy. And one of the fastest growing states, personal income growth, one of the fastest in the country, unemployment among the lowest in the country, and how things have changed in just a few short months. So what you try to do is you forecast frequently. As you get new data points, you update your forecasts. We're forecasting every couple weeks at this point. One of the other roles of DFM is managing the budget throughout the year. Idaho, unlike the federal government, has a constitutional obligation to balance the budget at the end of the state fiscal year. State fiscal year ends on June 30th. So if you just think about when COVID hit, Idaho really started seeing an impact mid-March. And then we had a state stay-at-home order for the month of April. And then we had a phased reopening starting in May. So that really impacted the end of our state fiscal year. And the other thing is most of our, if you look at our general fund, about 45% of it, depends on the year, but 45%, give or take, comes from income tax from individuals. And then another 7%, give or take, comes from income tax from corporations. And that traditionally comes in on April 15th. And the federal government actually delayed income tax filings federally to July 15th, which really would have wreaked havoc on our budgets. So what Governor Little did is he delayed Idaho state income tax filings from April to June, and that kept the revenue within the same fiscal year, but gave Idaho taxpayers who were substantially impacted by the shutdowns in March, April, and May a little bit more of a breather to be able to pay their tax bill to the extent they owed and were not expecting a refund. So DFM, we publish a monthly recap of how revenue came in each month, and April's always our biggest revenue month. We've got 2 bars on our website. It shows you what was expected versus what the actuals are. You'll see a huge shortfall in April, but it just shifted to June. The actuals versus expected in June look comically out of proportion because of the move in income tax filing. And ultimately, we ended the year with a balanced budget on June 30th, even with COVID, but that's because a couple things. One, income tax filings were stronger than forecasted. I told you we're starting to forecast more on the pessimistic side and hoping that they come in over, starting low. And we ended up cutting spending last year. We implemented a hiring freeze, a salary freeze, things like that to try to slow agency spending as we neared the end of the year. So we ended up year balanced and with a little bit of a surplus. But the huge caveat is income tax filings are based off of what happened in calendar year 2019 when things were red hot and the economy was going strong. We know there's going to be a substantial impact on income tax in calendar year 2020. So we've made a mid-year budget adjustment as well. The governor has limited authority to make mid-year budget adjustments. The legislature does review those when they reconvene in the subsequent session. But to address what we anticipate to be an 8 to 14% budget shortfall in the current fiscal year, the governor has asked agencies to cut their budgets by 5%. And then the remainder of the budget gap would be made up with our rainy day funds or federal funds to the extent they become available in packages authorized by Congress. Some states have borrowed. Some states are talking about raising taxes. Those have not been well-received options in the state of Idaho, so the governor has taken those off the table. So our gap in 21 will be made up by a mix of cuts, rainy day funds, and federal funds to the extent they're available. On the cut side, I guess the one thing I would say is cuts are relative. Our budget was going to grow 4.4% and some change year over year. So a 5% cut is, on par with where we were in calendar year 2020. So that means a lot of the new discretionary projects might not go forward. The other thing is we're seeing a lot of state agencies that had significant travel. We have, Department of Commerce and Ag who do a lot of international trade missions, things like that. For obvious reasons, travel has slowed. University professors aren't going to as many conferences, things like that. So a lot of agencies were able to derive savings from just natural, occurrences that have occurred in conjunction with COVID.
So to make sure the students are following along, when we say fiscal year 21, we're in that now, correct?
We are. It goes from
Yeah.
July 1 of this year, 2020, through June 30th of 21.
It can get a little confusing with the fiscal years.
Absolutely.
So in terms of implementing the budget on a day-to-day basis throughout the year, I was thinking about the extreme challenges that the Department of Labor has faced with the sudden crush of unemployment applications and, new and awkward rules from the feds about who can get money that don't track onto our historic computer systems and all kinds of things that made that complicated. When an agency has something of a crisis happen like that, where they need more people or they don't necessarily need more permanent employees, but they need more resources all of a sudden, how does that work?
Sure. So your example, Department of Labor, they're a very cyclical agency. They staff up in times of recession and then run a little bit leaner when times are good. Idaho had been in a stretch of really good years coming out of the last recession. So the Department of Labor had closed down some regional offices. The staff size had shrunk. Usually what happens with a recession is there's a very long lead in and there's quite a bit of time to make those adjustments and start staffing up. Coronavirus is really kind of a unicorn in how quickly things went down. We went from a historically low unemployment rate in Idaho, sub 3%, to a historically high unemployment rate, 11.5% in a matter of weeks. There was no reasonable way for any state's Department of Labor to staff up in that short period of time, because it's not just a matter of getting bodies and seats, it's ensuring that they have the technical expertise necessary to answer some pretty complicated and convoluted claims adjudication questions and things like that. And sometimes you have to take your best workers off the line to train the incoming workers, which in the short term exacerbates the problem while offering long-term relief. But the ray of hope is oftentimes in recessions, you start to see some federal dollars flowing. And Congress has passed, 3.5 bills is what they jokingly refer to it as. And they're currently considering a fourth package. And in those bills, there was money available to the Department of Labor to help offset some of the costs associated with the administration of the new Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Program, the extra $600 a week on top of traditional unemployment benefits, and that helped them through a little bit of it. Idaho as a state also received $1.25 billion in funding to address COVID-specific costs. And we've put, I believe, 13 million of that to the Department of Labor. That helped them staff up, but not just staffing up, paying out overtime costs. The employees that we did have there, we've asked them to work a couple extra hours each day to help clear out the backlog. But with that comes a responsibility to ensure that they're financially compensated for that extra time appropriately. We've also invested some of those funds in going to the private sector and standing up private call centers. By going to the private sector, you can leverage call centers that have expertise in labor claims adjudication, things like that, without having the significant lead up time of having to train individuals to that expertise. But those federal funds come in outside of a legislative session, and the legislature, through statutes passed by them and signed by previous governors, gives the governor limited authority to recognize those federal funds and use those federal funds if they were not known at the time that the legislature convened. So, for example, I might get the dates slightly wrong, but I believe our legislature adjourned around March 20th this year. The federal package that gave the $1.25 billion to Idaho, as well as some of the funds directly to the Department of Labor and other entities, passed Congress around March 27th. So these were funds that were not known at the time that our legislature adjourned. So the governor has some limited discretion to determine whether or not these funds are appropriate, should be used by the agencies. And should the governor make that determination, we have a state board of examiners comprised of the Secretary of State and Attorney General, who will also take a look at those and approve the use of them outside of a legislative session. Why that's important is we're a state that elects the Secretary of State and Attorney General separately and independently from the governor. Those are statewide elected offices who are duly elected by the people of Idaho. So to provide some checks and balances to ensure that these funds truly are for their intended purpose, weren't known at the time, and should benefit the people of Idaho should they be recognized outside of a legislative session.
Now, I saw this morning on Twitter, the world's most reliable policymaking distribution mechanism, that the state might have a special session of the legislature soon, which the governor, of course, calls, to determine, I think this is about liability issues, and I can't remember the other thing.
Elections.
Oh, how the election will happen in November. Oh, those are gigantic issues in and of themselves. But I wonder, are they going to want to start giving direction about that $1.25 billion, and will they run it through like a mini JFAC process?
So constitutionally, the governor and only the governor can call a special session, and it's for a limited purpose. And the governor, the direction he's given to the legislature is to give him a specific bill by August 17th, and he will then sharpen the focus of the special session based on the bills that are submitted. It's his intention, as he told the legislature this morning, to limit that to elections issues as well as business and school liability issues. I do not anticipate that appropriations or funding will be part of that. Certainly the legislature will have a significant oversight role of how those federal funds were spent when they reconvene in January. And to the extent any of the money is ongoing beyond January, the legislature will have the ability to reallocate or reappropriate as they deem necessary and appropriate.
In my limited experience with this, it seems like the hit on public sector agencies, especially local governments, when a recession hits, is about 12 to 18 months, before the real hits start coming in. There's sort of a delay on property tax payments and all that kind of stuff. So will the state look at providing fiscal assistance to cities and counties that are essential service providers or school districts? Of course, they already have many funding streams, but do you think there'll be a call to look at more of that?
Sure. So, if you think about a recession, this impacts both states and locals. You have the impact on revenue and how volatile your revenue is. You'll see declines in revenue. Oftentimes, simultaneously, you see increasing costs. Cost at Department of Labor. You have more people on Medicaid. You have, just all kinds of costs that are accruing here. How hard a county is hit, for example. If there's an outbreak in their jail, they could have significant corrections costs. They could have significant overtime cost if A number of police officers are out sick and they have to pull in others to cover their shifts. So, the challenge is always twofold: revenue decreases and spending increases. If you think of local government budgets, a large fraction of local government budgets are property tax, which are a little bit more stable in the short term, but do have some delayed issues, as your professor noted. And then sales tax is also pretty volatile in the short term. But our forecast, even under the pessimistic scenarios, would still suggest some level of revenue growth from sales tax in the short term. But a lot of that is driven by population growth, and Idaho continues to be one of the fastest growing states. And in particular, COVID doesn't seem to have slowed that down, and if anything, has perhaps accelerated the pace with which people are considering relocating to Idaho. So if some of the sales tax growth is from population growth, even moderate increases in sales tax revenue doesn't necessarily mean we're keeping up with per capita growth. So spending could become an issue for the local government. So in terms of how the state is planning on helping them out, one of the first things we did is when we got that 1.25 billion, the state had no obligation to provide any to local governments. But it was pretty darn important to Governor Little that a substantial fraction of that go to local governments to cover their direct costs. And we made an allocation available to each city and county. And then Idaho has a lot of special purpose taxing districts. It was our judgment that ambulance districts and fire districts could have some substantial impacts associated with COVID. So we made allocations available to the ambulance, fire districts, as well as cities and counties. And what we did is we asked each of them to benchmark their potential COVID expenses from March 1 to December 30th, which is the time frame that the federal funds are usable. And they provided us those estimates. And then we multiplied it by a certain factor to give them a cushion, knowing that some counties would be harder hit than others. And even some of the smaller counties who might not have a critical access hospital in their county might have some significant medical transport costs and things like that. So we provided a cushion. So far, it seems to have helped them. Cities and counties have generally spent less than 1% of the allocation that we gave them, which to me is a positive thing. That suggests that they're being fiscally conservative and prudent and holding on to it in case they have significant outbreaks later this fall or winter. But it also would suggest to me that we've given them a buffer to absorb the cost increases that they have, so that they won't have to pass that on in the form of additional property taxes or other fees to their citizens. Just to give you some examples, cities have had a lot of employees working remotely, and they've had to adjust their council meetings to online council meetings. So you'll see them use it for a lot of laptops and Zoom subscription types of things. Those that have physical presences, so county courthouses, county jails, things like that, they've had a lot of costs for PPE, so masks, gloves, sanitizers, plexiglass to create space for the county clerks, things like that. So you've seen a lot of those types of costs. The other thing we've done as a state is responding to a pandemic and recession. A lot of it isn't just the direct healthcare cost, it's also the economic recovery costs. So you try to stabilize the economy, inject some money to get the macro economy going again. And a lot of what we've done at the state side is put our money towards small business support, return to work bonuses for workers who came back into the workforce. And we've encouraged local governments to do the same. Local governments are much better positioned than we are at the state level to identify true impacts to their local businesses, if they might have some specific equipment needs, things like that. And we've encouraged the cities and counties to start looking at that. Plus, we've had some jurisdictions, Ada County is a good example, where through a district health order, bars were specifically closed in Ada County for a period of time. That didn't impact other counties. So Ada County or the city of Boise is looking at deploying some of the aid that we provided them to supporting those businesses, to ensuring that we aren't continuing the cycle of unemployment, business closures, and things like that.
Understood. Well, it's an interesting time to be running the state budget, and I wish you and the governor luck and wisdom as you try to negotiate this. This is going to be an interesting several months, and hopefully when I see you in January for the next State of the State address, there'll be sort of a more hopeful new normal looking for us. Thanks for taking the time to meet with us, Dr. Adams. I appreciate it, and best of luck with DFM.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Take care.